Last time we talked about the universality of the fascist philosophy, liberty, capitalism, individualism, and so on. Today we're going to dive into Mussolini's views on socialism, and well, this was supposed to have socialism as just part of the video, and then my script got out of hand. So, how about we just do socialism versus fascism today? But first, I'd like to address a question I got on the last video. What about Giovanni Gentile? Gentile was a fascist theorist who worked with Mussolini, so why didn't I mention him? Well, for starters, the total script for these two videos was pushing 7,000 words. And now it's 3 videos and like 9,000 words. I wanted the explanation to be manageable, so I abridged a bit the first time around. Maybe too much so. Giovanni is certainly part of the history of fascism, and he's known as the philosopher of fascism. Mussolini acted as the face and the fist of the ideology. He represented it and gave it action and motion in the world. Gentile was more theoretical, philosophical, and foundational in a very real and important way that affected the actual ideology in the real world. My first look at fascism was perhaps overly focused on the way Mussolini manifested the ideology in real life. I originally wanted to address the more practical end of fascism rather than just the theoretical end, but that thought kind of ended in this script. Today we talk about both theory and practice, and both Gentile and Mussolini. And they've got a few supporting cast members too. Right then, on with the show. What is the relationship between fascism and socialism? That is a complex question. Some of the answer will overlap with the last video's little bit on economics, so sorry about that. Socialism today is very different from how Marx conceived it in his day, and different from how Mussolini and others perceived it in their time. In some respects, ideologies are always in some sort of a state of flux. So what we can do is look at how Mussolini interacted with the socialism of his time and place. Keep in mind that socialism and even Mussolini himself were constantly evolving in their beliefs, and so too did the relationship between the two. Now, at first glance, and because of the state of things nowadays, it's tempting to believe that fascism and socialism are in fact diametrically opposed, when in fact they are not. But there are differences, and Mussolini had his share of conflicts with socialism and socialists. As we shall see, these conflicts are born out of differing methodologies rather than a complete opposition to one another's goals. Then we'll turn to examine the similarities, and another facet will be revealed, not just from the philosophy of fascism, but also in the statements Mussolini himself made on the subject. But first, let us now look at the differences, the conflicts, and the friction that existed between socialism and fascism under Benito Mussolini. Mussolini joined the Italian Socialist Party in the early 1900s. In the second half of Mussolini's doctrinal writing, he makes some notes about his initial stint with the Socialist Party from 1904 to 1914. He was eventually booted out for supporting Italian intervention in World War I, but in the meantime, he climbed the ranks of the local socialist hierarchy and later wrote that, quote, "It was never an experience in theory. My doctrine, even during that period, was a doctrine of action." As time went on, he began to have two main complaints about socialism in Italy. First, that it was lacking a firm universal definition under an ongoing revisionist movement of the time, but second, that it never evolved into action. Mussolini wrote that it eventually existed only as a grudge. And as we know from the first two videos, Mussolini was always a man of action, even as a socialist. Giovanni Gentile would later write that Mussolini had come to despise the futility of the socialists who kept preaching a revolution, which they had neither the power nor the will to bring to pass, even under the most favorable circumstances. His complaint then wasn't of, say, socialism versus capitalism, but rather of Italian socialism being inept and inactive versus his desire to actively make things happen by force. Mussolini had some specific complaints with socialism as an ideology, namely that socialism was and still is overly enamored with class warfare. Yet he also noted that real-life class needs and disparities had inspired the rise of socialism in the first place. He asserted that fascism was willing and able to meet those needs, but he took issue with socialism's obsessive class warfare because 1. He felt the state could forcibly correct class differences, and 2. the eternal class struggle would weaken the unity that citizens could find in the state. He asserted that class warfare couldn't really bring people together or bring about the societal change that was necessary for the strength of the nation. Dr. A. James Gregor quotes Mussolini as critiquing socialism like this: "The socialist revolution was a pure and simple question of force. Between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, no accord is possible. One must disappear. The weaker will be eliminated. The forceful elimination of a class out of society would ultimately weaken the country, the nation, a situation that Mussolini would obviously find unacceptable." In 1921, Mussolini stated that between fascists and communists, there are plenty of intellectual affinities. Like them, we believe in the necessity for a centralized and unitary state, imposing an iron discipline on everyone, but with the difference that they reach this conclusion through the idea of class, we through the idea of the nation. Mussolini wanted to reach equity through internal unity, not through internal conflict. In 1925, Alfredo Rocco, the Italian justice minister, would opine that socialist concerns about class justice were in fact warranted, but that, quote, "the fascist doctrine enacting justice among the classes in compliance with the fundamental necessity of modern life does away with class self-defense, which, like individual self-defense in the days of barbarism, is a source of disorder and civil war, and only one solution is possible: the realization of justice among the classes by and through the state." Mussolini completely endorsed the idea. The state could create equity between the classes, and the classes didn't need to defend themselves. The state would be the arbiter and the equalizer. Marx's idea was, of course, for the state to dissolve, or as Engels would put it, wither away, but Mussolini saw the state as both means and an end in and of itself, including the creation of equity. This is, and was arguably, a post-Marxist idea that the state was not something to be abolished, as much as it was a tool to be utilized for the greater good. In 1919, Mussolini would declare war against socialism, but this seems to be against Italian socialism because it wasn't nationalistic or state-centric enough, among its other shortcomings. There needed to be a vehicle to move his ideas forward, and that vehicle, from Mussolini, was the state, and this is how Mussolini differentiated Italian fascism from Italian socialism. At the same time, there are many similarities between fascism and socialism, not just in the words, but also in the actions and ideology of the leaders of the fascist movement. It is there that we turn our attention next. Historians Roger Kimball, Paul Johnson, and Dr. A. James Gregor have all made statements about Mussolini in relation to Marxism. They refer to him specifically as a Marxist heretic, and Kimball even goes so far as to state that Mussolini used the title on himself. A heretic is a believer in a system who has varied or modified beliefs about that system that are outside of the orthodoxy. It is a very different concept from an apostate, which is one who has rejected a system and then gone in the opposite direction. But heretics are often very closely related to the source ideology. Sunnis and Shias are both Muslims, even though they consider the other side to be heretics. Yet those outside of Islam tend to shrug and say, sure, but they're both real Muslims. Similarly, it is my considered opinion that the differences between collectivist ideologies are most hotly contested between each other. It's an in-house debate. Simply put, the debate between Marxism, communism, and fascism is a debate of whose form of collectivism is best. The differences here are a matter of degrees, unless you ask the enthusiasts, in which case each one is entirely different from the other, as though we were comparing downhill skiing and badminton. There are differences between fascism and socialism, yes, but there's also a lot of similarities, and despite Mussolini's differences with socialism, he still had much in common with the ideology. Mussolini's backlash against the Socialist Party stemmed not only from their inaction, but also from the fact that they kicked him out. This seems to be a bit of a sore spot for old Benito. But as time went on, in the 1930s and 40s, he began identifying with more overtly socialist beliefs because even as a heretic, he wasn't building something completely new. And he wasn't alone. He was joined in his quest to craft and perfect Italian fascism with one Giovanni Gentile. Gentile ghostwrote for Mussolini on occasion, and even under his own name as the philosopher of fascism, and from 1897 to 1934 he was a prolific political writer. He was influenced in his beliefs and ideology not only by Hegel, but also by Karl Marx himself, and a revisionist Marxist philosopher named Georges Sorel. Sorel had a strong influence on both Gentile and Mussolini. Sorel also had a strong influence on the beliefs of one Vladimir Lenin, and he was trying to update and improve Marx's ideas that were falling apart at the time. Now, Sorel's big idea was called Syndicalism, and it's defined as a movement for transferring the ownership and the control of the means of production and distribution to workers' unions. In other words, it's a way to get the proletariat in control of the means of production. And just how did this syndicalism manifest in the fascist philosophers? Well, in 1925, Gentile wrote that it is well known that Sorelian syndicalism, out of which the thought and political method of fascism emerged, conceived itself as the genuine interpretation of Marxist communism. What Giovanni is saying here is that there's a difference between what is called socialist and what is practically socialist, and Sorel's syndicalism was more the practical form of Marxism. Historian Emilio Gentile would write that for Mussolini, syndicalism was the most modern embodiment of the spirit of Marxist doctrine, which he added to the myths of his Nietzschean aristocratic philosophy to reach a socialism of quality rather than quantity. One post-Marxist quote might help shed some additional light on the thought process of Mussolini, Gentile, and Sorel. Ernesto Laclau was a very far-left philosopher credited with creating post-Marxism. In 1990, he said, "I haven't rejected Marxism. Something very different has occurred. It's Marxism that has broken up, and I believe I'm holding on to the best fragments." I feel this is important to note because the wiki article on Mussolini says that he abandoned Marxism. This is true in the sense that it was also true for many far-left and socialist figures since Marx. In a very real sense, 100% authentic Marxist thought died with Karl Marx. Anything beyond that point represents a modification, an expansion, a departure, an addendum, a dilution, or even a heresy of the original thought. Marx had been dead nearly 50 years, and socialism would have to move on if it was to survive. Georges Sorel, the Marxist revisionist, had created Sorelian syndicalism, which both Gentile and Mussolini saw as being the best, most realistic, and most genuine interpretation of Marxism in the real world. Or perhaps it was one of the best fragments, if you will. Both Gentile and Mussolini worked out their ideas of fascism from that interpretation. Sorel would spend the last years of his life supporting the Russian Revolution and communism, which he felt adhered to his syndicalism. Mussolini would do the same, but in Italy, pursuing his fascist empire. And Giovanni was not distant from these circles either, as Dr. A. James Greger would write, quote, "Many of the principal theoreticians of fascism, as we have seen, had been schooled in Marxism, and like Giovanni Gentile, demonstrated a competence in the material that won the admiration of Lenin himself." In other words, Mussolini, Gentile, and Sorel were not far removed from the doctrine of Marxism, nor were they trying to abolish it. They were simply trying to modify it and improve it to find a better way forward with the same collectivist mentality. Marx saw fallibility in government, but Sorel was confident in Mussolini as he declared, "Mussolini is not an ordinary socialist. He's the only man with the strength to correct the weakness of the government." Benito himself would remark of Sorel, "I owe most to Georges Sorel. This master of syndicalism, by his rough theories of revolutionary tactics, has contributed most to form the discipline, energy, and power of the fascist cohorts." Now, ideologies and theory aside, how did all of this manifest in Mussolini as the face of fascism and the hand that guided it? For that, we look to his own words of policy on the matter. In 1919, the same year he had declared war on socialism, Mussolini made a series of demands on behalf of his movement. "We want an extraordinary heavy taxation with a progressive character on capital that will represent an authentic partial expropriation of all wealth, seizure of all assets of religious congregations, which constitutes an enormous deficit of the nation and a privilege for the minority, revisions of all contracts made by the war ministers, and seizure of 85% of all war profits." In so doing, Mussolini was demonstrating his desire to go after the one-percenters, the bourgeoisie, the elite, and the profits, which is a very socialist attitude indeed. Moreover, Mussolini was deeply critical of free market capitalism. In 1933, he declared, "Today we can affirm that the capitalistic method of production is out of date. So is the doctrine of laissez-faire, the theoretical basis for capitalism." Instead, his ideas hinged on a state-run economy. A year later, in 1934, he said, "3/4 of the Italian economy, industrial and agricultural, is in the hands of the state. And if I dare to introduce to Italy state capitalism or state socialism, which is the reverse side of the medal, I will have the necessary subjective and objective conditions to do it." This is interesting because Mussolini used the term state capitalism for his economic doctrine, a phrase coined and previously used by Vladimir Lenin for Russia's communist economic doctrine. Interestingly enough, Mussolini refers to state socialism as the reverse side of the medal. In other words, state capitalism and state socialism are two sides of the same coin. They are more alike than they are different. In such a state, there is no such thing as free market economics. The state simply takes control as an active force in the name of the greater good. This attitude was illustrated in a 1925 speech made by Italian Justice Minister Alfredo Rocco, where he declared, quote, "The state must become active in behalf of everybody for the welfare of the people. It must intervene when necessary in order to improve the material, intellectual, and moral conditions of the masses. It must find work for the unemployed, instruct and educate the people, and care for health and hygiene." Mussolini blessed the declaration as a masterful description of fascism. So what was the goal of the fascist state-run and controlled economy? Mussolini made that abundantly clear. The object of the fascist regime in the economic field is to ensure higher social justice for the whole of the Italian people. What does social justice mean? It means work guaranteed, fair wages, decent homes. It means the possibility of continuous evolution and improvement. Nor is this enough. It means that workers must enter more and more intimately into the productive process and share its necessary discipline. As the past century was the century of capitalist power, the 20th century is the century of power and glory of labor. Workers were not to be just schlubs at the end of the production line. They were to be part of the process. They were to be integrally involved in the control, management, and ownership of the means of production through the aforementioned syndicalism. By the 1940s, much of Mussolini's rhetoric had turned outwards because of the approaching storm clouds of war, and he began to compare fascist Italy with the other nations they were warring against. He would cast the scene of war as the workers, the nations of the collective, warring against the power holders. By the start of the Second World War, he had declared, "We go to battle against the plutocratic and reactionary democracies of the West. This gigantic struggle is nothing other than a phase in the logical development of our revolution. It is the struggle of peoples that are poor but rich in workers against the exploiters who hold on ferociously to the monopoly off all the riches and all the gold of the earth." The classical proletariat versus bourgeoisie reasoning is quite clear here. In 1941, he opined, "When the war is over, it will be followed by a more equitable distribution of the earth's riches. The fascist revolution will make another decisive step to shorten social distances." He would later state his goal of socialization and say that it was, quote, "the implantation of Italian socialism. We are fighting to impose a higher social justice. The others are fighting to maintain the privileges of caste and class. We are proletarian nations that rise up against the plutocrats. For this, I have been and am a socialist. The accusation of inconsistency has no foundation. My conduct has always been straight in the sense of looking at the substance of things and not to the form. I adapted socialisticamente to reality. As the evolution of society belied many of the prophecies of Marx, the true socialism folded from possible to probable. The only feasible socialism, socialisticamente, is corporatism, confluence, balance, and justice interests compared to the collective interests. This seems to be his final word on the subject as he was summarily executed later that year, but in these statements he makes it clear. Fascism was about decreasing socio-economic distances or striving for equity of outcome, increasing social justice, and remaking socialism into something more practically doable. Now, one final thing we must note is the mistreatment of socialists in Italy, that is, those of the Italian Socialist Party. Mussolini was not kind to them, but it's my opinion that in this case we should not look with a lens focused on belief, but with a lens focused on power. Like many others, Mussolini was a Marxist heretic, but that does not mean he tolerated heretics within his own realm. While socialism, in Mussolini's words, might be the flip side of the coin, the small differences tend to matter internally if tails is trying to take power from heads. Mussolini would crack down on anyone potentially challenging his power. Remember his rule: no groups or political parties outside of the state. Quote, all within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state, unquote. It's not that they were socialists per se, it's that they weren't his kind of socialists. They were inept Italian socialists, and it appears that he never forgave them for squandering their opportunity to bring about the revolution, and he was not about to tolerate their distraction from his noble efforts. Mussolini and his political entourage may not have been Marxist socialists in the purest sense of the term, but then neither was Lenin. In fact, neither are the far-left post-Marxists of today, the ones we call socialists. Finding a pure Marxist was and is a bit of a rarity both then and now. This is because Marxism experienced failures, and the philosophers of the early to mid-1900s had to modify the doctrine out of sheer necessity. This created a heresy, a modification, and a departure from the purest sense of the Marxist doctrine. And yet, on the other hand, the words of these men leave little doubt that even in his heresy, Mussolini and his fascism agreed with much of the ideology. This is because the difference between socialism and fascism is far more a question of methods than a question of goals. Mussolini and the others like him weren't trying to destroy Marxism. Rather, they were trying to improve upon it and then implement their shiny new version that they called Italian fascism. Next time, we'll cover religion, race, and a few other little fun topics. You won't want to miss it. Stay tuned.